it is always useful to look at the broader horizon. That's why we first will start in our deliberations to pose the Finnish demographic trends in a global European context and also have the long time horizon. Next, we will try to assess this question of what is the demographic burden or the burden of population aging that people are so concerned about, and we will look at different ways that can be assessed, and not all these ways look as dramatic as the most conventional way by just looking at the changing age structure without considering labor force participation and productivity. Then, of course, as has already been mentioned by Olli Koski, governments are very interested in policies and what are the policies that can possibly influence fertility, migration, labor force participation, and education. And we'll show the results of some scenarios, some micro simulation models that show the longer term implications of alternative interventions. And we will close in putting demography again into the broader context of sustainable development and sustainable human well-being. And I will propose to see population policies as some broader way of policies for national human resource management. Okay, Finland has the world's longest annual demographic time series, starting in 1722. And I only discovered this when I had the opportunity to work right after my undergraduate studies at the University of Vienna as an äitiys-lomasijainen, a maternity leave substitute in the Finnish Statistical Office, Tilastokeskus. And actually my dissertation here is entitled Finnish Fertility since 1722. Finland was part of the Swedish kingdom at that time, started in the whole kingdom in 1749 with this famous Tabellverket to collect this annual information, not only about the number of births and deaths, but also about the resident population, which is the denominator for calculating demographic rates. In Finland, a later effort really could reconstruct on the level of the data collected by the parishes in Åbo in the Diocese of Turku. It was Jutikala who reconstructed this back to 1722, why this precise year, you may remember from school that Uudenkaupungin Rauha, the peace treaty of 1721, took place and the country was devastated. It was a war between Russia and Sweden. And after that peace treaty, they wanted to know how to repopulate Finland, and they needed to know how many births and deaths there are. And that's sort of the basis for establishing this system. And we added here some medium population projections up to the end of this century. So we have almost 400 years of population trends. And what you see here is in red the death rates, and in blue the crude birth rates. They are simply births and deaths per thousand of the population. And what is typical for a pre-modern country, you see strong fluctuations, especially the fluctuations in the death rates. And you can identify some of the years. I will only point about the famous famine, the Nälkävuodet of 1868-69, where more than a third of all children died in Finland. This was a crop failure together with serious disease. And after that disaster, you see the red line started a continuous decline with much fewer oscillations. You only see World War I and World War II here marked. At the same time, the birth rates stayed at a relatively high level. You see until about 1900, the blue line did not decline much. And with the birth rates being much higher than the death rates, this is where population growth comes from. So in Finland, we had about 1% population growth per year, which is lower than many developing countries today, but still it was significant population growth. And as you know, this was also the time when many Finns migrated overseas because they didn't find a livelihood in their own country. And then you see early in the 20th century, the birth rates also starting a decline. We have no time to summarize the complex reasons for this, but I've personally sort of worked on a theory that I call cognition-driven demographic transition. This means that it has to do with basic education of women, essentially that from a rather uncontrolled regime of fertility, now parity-specific fertility control, so depending on the number of children already born, is introduced as a conscious behavior. It's also called family limitation. And this is very much in line with the big survey of European countries by the Princeton European Fertility Project, where the director of that project, Ansley Cole, said as the first precondition for a lasting fertility decline that fertility must be within the calculus of conscious choice. Meaning women don't take as many children as God gives them, not in a fatalistic manner, but start more abstractly in the planning behavior, think about their own family size. And this is very closely related to literacy. And it was indeed that literacy spread very rapidly among young people after these hunger years. And by the beginning of the 20th century, most young women could already read and write. So this is about the historical trend in Finland. Now here we take a developing country on which I've also written a book and which is a good example for a long historical time series. It's the island of Mauritius that until World War II and deep into the 60s has been used as a textbook case of a country trapped in the vicious circle of rapid population growth, extreme poverty, and environmental degradation. You see in blue and red the same crude birth rates, and red the death rates. You see that initially up to World War II they were about at the same level, and then after World War II malaria eradication took place and antibiotics were brought to Mauritius and many other hygiene and medical reforms, and you see the red line, the death rate almost overnight fell to half of its previous levels. But the birth rates actually stayed high. They even increased a little because women had a higher health status, could have shorter birth intervals. And then you see that the green line, which is the rate of population increase, the natural rate, the difference between birth and death rates, is about even 30 per thousand, so 3% population growth per year, which is almost a doubling every 20 years. And this was much more rapid than what we had seen in historical Europe, where it was a maximum of about 1 year. So this is typical for developing countries, where then in the 60s, we had what was called by many the population explosion. And then you see the time scale is a bit stretched here. It has, zooming into the 1960s, there was really a very rapid decline then in fertility, one of the world's most rapid fertility declines, again through universal literacy education campaigns for women and government-led family planning programs. Okay, here we see a contemporary view of based on the demographic and health survey. These are 58 the developing countries, where we even have 6 different levels of educational attainment. And we see that sort of each country is listed where it has its average fertility. That's what you see on the x-axis. And in every single country, you have the women without any formal education who've never seen a school from inside, by far the highest fertility rate. And then you see gradually with incomplete primary down to lower secondary, upper secondary, and post-secondary, the lowest birth rate. So in all, even in the African countries with the highest fertility, let's take Ethiopia as an example, women without education in rural Ethiopia have 6 or 7 children on average, whereas more educated women with some post-secondary education have less than 2 children on average. And this again is strong confirmation of this cognition-driven fertility transition. We've translated this into many different alternative scenarios for the world population. So as you know, at the moment, we stand at about 7.8 billion people. But of course, you have to start projections in a year where you have valid empirical information. So here, this was 2010-11, where the countries have a round of censuses every 10 years. Most countries in the world have censuses. So the data for today are already based on some projections. And you see here the green area, this is the uncertainty range as given by the UN Population Division. And then you see the 3 lines in color. These are scenarios that have been developed at IASA together with a big consortium of international global change research institutions. They are called the Shared Socioeconomic Pathways, which are used a lot in the assessment of climate change and sustainable development. You see there the medium, the SSP2 is the green line, which is a little lower than what the UN assumes, particularly in the second half of the century. And the main reason is that we are more optimistic as education being a driver of fertility decline, and we have education explicitly as part of our projections. What you see then there in this blue area below is here we calculated what would the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, as the UN settled them in 2015. They also have ambitious health goals that include reproductive health. They have very ambitious education goals, universal secondary education for all. So if they are being implemented, they would still bring down world population growth to lower than the medium variant here. So we may not even reach 10 billion people, and then it would level off or decline somewhat by the end of the century. But there's huge uncertainty around this, so it's really rather speculative what will happen in the second half of the century. Okay, here you see a projection for the world population. This is the medium scenario, the SSP2, by level of education. Here we only have 4 educational groups. So while in the 1950s, the vast majority of the world population was still right here without any formal education. Actually, by 2010, quite significant progress had been made. And you see in gray is the children, and in dark red is people who have never had the opportunity for education. Yellow means with some primary, and the majority of the world population today has at least some secondary education. And not so many yet have tertiary, but over time, there's a near certainty that the education distribution will improve, because in virtually every country, the young cohorts, the young generations are better educated than the older ones. And through this process of generational replacement that we also call demographic metabolism, the younger ones will move up the age pyramid and will replace the less educated older ones. And therefore, even without too much additional progress in education, the world will become better educated on average. Okay, now let's look at Finland. We have, for all countries in the world, reconstructed the age, sex, and education composition to 1950, and then had these scenarios to 2100. You have an age pyramid, always sort of women on the right and men on the left, and then you have the 5-year age groups, and now you have as the third dimension here, color, giving you the educational attainment level. So by 1950, all Finns had at least some education, unless in many developing countries you don't have any people who've never seen a school. But you see the vast majority only had some primary education. Only for the younger cohorts in 1950, you see this light blue, which is secondary education, and very, very few had post-secondary education, which is the dark blue. Now, next slide, please. By 1985, this has already changed dramatically. But let's first look at the shape of the pyramid. You see this distinct plateau, if you want, after the age group 35 to 39. These are the big cohorts born during the baby boom, which in Finland was very early, right after World War II in the late 40s. So these men and women are already in 85, then 35 to 39 years old. And you see a sizable proportion of them has already received tertiary education, whereas the proportion with only primary has virtually disappeared among the young cohorts, but still is very dominant among the older age groups. Again, this is this process of demographic metabolism as societies changing from the bottom and moving up gradually the age pyramid. So this is Finland today, 1920. You see now again the plateau. These big cohorts are now 70 to 74-year-old. And you see a high proportion of them do have post-secondary education. And you see an interesting phenomenon that exists in many developed countries, but is particularly pronounced in Finland, that women are much better educated than men. It's not the case for the very old groups who went to school before World War II, but for those educated in the recent decades, there's a clearly higher proportion of women with post-secondary education than men. Okay, this is a projection now, a medium projection to 2050. In the way you see it, the population projections are quite easy. You only sort of shift up these age groups in the pyramid every 5 years, one step, 5 year. And of course, here we have bigger steps. We have now a 30-year step. And you only have to adjust for mortality, like how many people die at different ages. And mortality greatly differs also by level of education. So we have education-specific mortality. Education-specific fertility, these are the people moved to the bottom of the pyramid, the new babies born. And then, of course, migration can also influence. So you have to make assumptions about these factors, and then you have a relatively good basis for doing long-term projections, better actually than in any other social science. Because if we know, let's say, how many 25 to 29-year-old women have completed secondary education, we know quite well how many 55 to 59-year-old women 30 years down the road will have the same level of education. For industrialized countries, we've done it for more education categories because it's really more interesting to see not only post-secondary, but we have here a short post-secondary, then a bachelor degree, a master degree. And here you see, if you look to the women on the right-hand side, that actually there has been a change for those below age 45. They have to a much higher degree, a formal bachelor degree, and significant proportion with master's degree, and again, it's more the women than the men. Okay, here you just see now the stocks projected for Finland in the medium scenario by 8 education categories up to 2050. You see, as it has already been mentioned before, that education has reached some sort of a saturation. You still have the younger ones a little better educated than the older ones, but since there has been so much effort in education already in the 60s and 70s in Finland, the trend extrapolation of education expansion that underlies these do not show much further progress. And we will discuss this as a scenario assumption in the following. Find all these data for any country in the world at any point in time, and all the education categories and other demographic indicators on this Wittgenstein Center Data Explorer. Now let's go to the burden of demographic dependency. There are really different ways of measuring and addressing this. The most frequently used conventional measure is the so-called old age dependency ratio, which is just taking in any population the proportion of the population above the age of 65 divided by that 15 to 64, in some cases 20 to 64 is chosen. This is different from the young age dependency, which looks at children 0 to 15 and also divided by the so-called working age. But then this assumes in a way that everybody between the age range of 15 and 64 is economically active, is employed, which certainly is not the case. And the labor force dependency ratio is more precise in this, that it considers actual labor force participation rates rather than assuming that in a way the productive life ends for everybody at age 65 and below 65 everybody works. But still, people who are in the labor force are not equally contributing to economic growth. So what we have as a third indicator here is what we call the productivity weighted labor force dependency ratio. How do we measure productivity? Well, economists usually measure productivity by wages. So what we do is we take the education groups that we've just estimated and showed you, and then look at the average wages in each education group. And that is our approximation then of the productivity of the different education groups and how the composition changes. Okay, here you see an important slide. Here you see the time trend of these 3 different dependency ratios. This has been done for the European Union of the 28, still including the UK because it was produced last year. So we scale it to 1. So whatever the current level of the dependency ratio is today, is there at the beginning. And then you see the green line which is the conventional old age dependency ratio. And this indeed signals a very dramatic burden of future population aging. It will increase by over 60% on average in the European Union by 2060. But as I said, in a way, this over-dramatizes the picture. If we already take the labor force dependency ratio, which only sort of looks at the number of people who are in the labor force and those who are not in the labor force, then the increase is much lower. It's only about 20% increase over the coming 40 years. And if we take this in blue line, which is the productivity weighted labor force participation dependency, less increase, because in many countries, particularly in Southern Europe, the education expansion is more recent, and still more and more educated people move up the age pyramid and are more productive. And then you only see about a 10% increase over a period of 40 years, which isn't really very dramatic at all. Okay, in a recent paper in PNAS, we do now some micro simulations with also playing with migration, because there is always the notion out there that migrants could in a way replace the missing birth and help to ameliorate population aging in Europe. So we also have migrants by their level of education. We have it by their duration of stay in the country, because that matters also for their labor force participation, and also what the spouses, whether they are part of the labor force. So we have a really rather complex micro simulation model here that shows that indeed the blue line is the same one that we had before. There's about 10% increase. Now, if we take on more migrants, we call it the Canadian migration assumption, because Canada has a massive volume of immigrants, but without integration efforts and no education, then we see a burden. So many migrants that are not well integrated and that have low level of education actually increase the dependency burden here. This is the productivity weighted. But then if we have more educated migrants, and in particular you see these dotted lines where we assume Swedish labor force participation, that all countries, including Swedish, including Italian and Greek women, would slowly start to work as much as Swedish women already work today. And then you actually see a decline. Despite of the massive population aging, you see a significant decline by 10 or even 20% in this labor force dependency ratio, the productivity weighted dependency ratio. This just shows that the drama is not pre-programmed. There are really many parameters, many social adjustments, mechanisms that can ameliorate the situation or even improve it. Okay, here we've now did this for Finland. With Finland, you see the blue line, again, a massive increase in the old age dependency ratio, even more than on the European average, about 80% increase. Whereas if you look at the labor force dependency with or without the productivity weighting, it's much less. It's only a 30% increase. Now let's also look, we played with different scenarios. What would it imply if the total fertility rate either falls to 1.2, which is the blue line, or to stays around the, what we assume a medium average, 1.6, or the green line, it increases to 2.0. Well, in the short run, more babies would, of course, increase the youth dependency ratio. So there is a burden on society because these young people are not yet working. They cost money in terms of the health and the education and other services. So the benefits of higher fertility are really very long run benefits, and that is shown in the next slide. Yeah, we made an additional modification. I forgot to say that the blue line is the baseline expansion of education in Finland, where you see it stagnating around the 45 degrees because it's an extrapolation of the already saturated trend. But one could alternatively assume that it continues, that you have in the future 50 or 55% of the working age population with post-secondary education. And we already have countries like Singapore or South Korea where you have up to 70 to 80% of the young cohorts with post-secondary education. Okay, here now you see the adult productivity weighted labor force dependency ratio, which is sort of the active over the inactive adult population, again scaled to 1. Now you see the effect of additional education is quite significant. The dotted lines give you sort of the education plus, what I just showed you, more effects on education, because it increases, of course, the productivity as assumed in this model. The other interesting thing is that the different fertility scenarios don't affect the adult-based dependency ratio much until about after 2050, the second half of this century, because it takes so many years for these additional babies to enter the labor force and make a difference in the labor force dependency. So the positive effect, if you want, of a TFR of 2 children on average, which is rather high and unlikely, really only shows up after 2050. And then you see the other scenarios. If you have a low fertility, then the dependency gets another boost in the second half if we have very low fertility. That's the important message. In the near term, it doesn't change much to the economic benefit, but it has an additional burden on the youth dependency, whereas the effects of better education are visible right now, much earlier. And you also see that the downward shift in the dependency by the middle of the century is very significant and actually makes a bigger difference than the difference between the 2 or 3 education scenarios. Okay, I think we should come to a conclusion now. What does this all mean? What are we after? We don't want to just increase the GDP, but the task is to increase sustainable human well-being. And we've been developing an indicator there, as there are like 50, 60 different indicators out there on the market. We had sort of a tailor-made that would also be appropriate for sustainable development analysis that can be calculated not only on the national level, but also for subpopulations that we are interested in. We call it years of good life. It means that being alive is a necessary prerequisite for enjoying any quality of life. That seems self-evident, but mere survival is not good enough. We want to be in a good health status, and that's what we have on the left-hand side on the objective indicators. That's what Amartya Sen called a capable longevity, be out of poverty, and be free of severe cognitive or physical limitations. But then there's a big literature, and we also want to consider the subjective well-being, and here there needs to be a positive life satisfaction above a minimum level. So only the years of life where people are both objective indicators above minimum level as well as in subjective life satisfaction are counted as years of good life. In Finland, I just show you the graph of life expectancy here, as we have it in the data. You see again these fluctuations in the very long run, but then after the beginning of the 20th century, and in particular after the turmoil of World War II, you see a straight increase, almost a linear increase, reaching above 80. So this is the mere survival. But if we now add, please, the next slide, the quality of life, and this is a reconstruction of the years of good life, the yoga in blue line for Finland. So throughout Finnish history, mostly due to the widespread poverty that was in Finland in the 19th century, the years of good life are supposedly estimated to be quite a lot lower, almost 20 years lower than total life expectancy. Of course, we couldn't ask people about what their life satisfaction was in the 19th century, so we did some indirect estimation based on correlation analysis. But what you then see that up until now 80, 85, really the difference is converging. Years of good life are increasing more rapidly than total years of life, but only up to a certain point. And for the last 20, 30 years, we've seen an almost parallel upward shift. Why does it not continue to converge? Well, that's the consequence of population aging. And with an old population is a higher degree of disability, and there's limitations in daily life. And since they are prominently reflected in yogurt. We will never expect yogurt to reach the level of pure survival life expectancy, but rather see what we see here, sort of a constant and hopefully constant upward movement. So this is my last slide now, trying to summarize what does this mean in terms of population policies. And I've been writing about a 21st century population policy rationale, which really considers this more multidimensional approach to demography that I've shown to you. And the focus is there on primarily, and this is also in line with the focus of the Sustainable Development Goals, universal primary and secondary education. That was the SDG 4 said, and health, but in particular basic health. We don't focus so much on expensive, fancy, high-tech health. We are really talking about basic health services all around the world. So these are the priorities that are valid for all countries, both the poor as well as the rich ones. And this proposal to really focus on national human resource management for sustainable development is, unlike some earlier proposed population policies, really fully consistent with human rights. We don't have to go into this, but there's a history of non-voluntary family limitations, forced fertility declines, as we have seen in some countries. But after the Cairo World Population Conference in 1984, it has become a universal consensus that it should be congruent with human rights. And as I said, this is at the heart of the Millennium Development Goals that were from 2000 to 2015, and now the Sustainable Development Goals that are from 2015 to 2030. And there should be a specific focus on female education, which empowers women within the family and society to better meet their own reproductive rights. They can better look after it, pursue it, find the right health services, and also better meet their fertility aspirations. And this is again in line with what Olli Koski said initially, that women shouldn't be forced against something that is against their will. No, they should be empowered to meet their own fertility aspirations. In developing countries, this also means universally that higher education brings down desired family size, and women want fewer children and also find ways to have fewer children. But what is important for Finland, as well as other European countries, it really can help actual fertility to come closer to desired fertility. There is some evidence now in Sweden, for instance, where we see that more educated women actually have more children again. It's sort of a U-shaped pattern. The lowest education groups still have some unwanted pregnancies, but the highest educated can somehow arrange their life better. They can better combine work and family and are more able to actually meet their desired family size, which typically is 2 children. It contributes to poverty eradication and economic growth through increasing female labor force participation and productivity. There's a lot of economic literature. There's another literature that shows how this enhanced human capital contributes to the quality of institutions and democracy. And finally, it also helps to strengthen the mitigative and the adaptive capacity, the resilience to environmental change that has also been shown in many studies. We don't have the time now, and I've talked enough. I think I conclude my presentation here and hope you have many questions. Thank you very much.